Great, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Tonight we are going to be talking about the census, and it's that time of year once again after 10 years waiting for the census to happen again. Oops, that's the screen I wanted. The title of our webinar tonight is 2020 Census, Why Your Future Counts. And we have a great group of people to walk us through tonight, starting with Julian Camera, who is our field organizer at the ACLU of Colorado. We have Anna Temu, who is our immigration campaign coordinator, and Jessica Howard, who is our community education manager. And they all wish that I could talk better right now. So I'm going to turn it over to them. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them in the question box and we will read them at the end of the evening. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Delana. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you once. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? If not, okay.
Yeah, Jess.
Okay, for some reason, it keeps saying that a host has to disable the screen.
Oh.
Oh. Here we go. Sorry, my cursor is malfunctioning a little bit on me. That's super weird. Sorry about that. Huh. Sorry, my mouse disappeared. There we go. All right, here we go. Okay, so 62,700. That is the number of Colorado residents who are at risk of being undercounted in the census for 2020. The ACLU is, really committed to trying to bolster our efforts to ensure that hard to count communities in our state are counted for this, once every 10-year survey, because it is so important in determining redistricting of congressional seats, distribution of federal funds for underrepresented communities, and can really define where services are delivered. So before we go in to convince you to fill out your census, perhaps we should tell you what is the census. So the census, in the most general sense of the terms, is a process by which we systematically acquire information about members of a given population. For the US Census in particular, it's a decennial census, so it happens every 10 years. That is required by Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution to count populations in the United States in the 5 US territories. So we're talking about Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and I believe the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So every 10 years, the US government gets together, they count every person living in the United States. The census is basically a short questionnaire that asks basic information about your household and the people who live in it. I would probably consider to be one of, or if not the most inclusive civic activity or civic duty that we can partake upon, because it covers every single person and every single household here in the country. So the first census was taken in 1790. At the time, it was led by then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. And since then, we've had probably about 22 federal census surveys since then. The Census Bureau, which is the agency that is in charge of collecting the census data, is created under Title 13 of the United States Code and is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Not sure why commerce, but it is. It's important to know that, the census apportions allocations to Congress. As we all know, every state has 2 senators and then representatives that sit in the House based off of the apportionment of the population. And collectively, that determines things like in terms of electoral college in presidential elections. Currently, right now, Colorado sits at having 7 House of Representatives and then 2 senators for a number of 9 votes in the electoral college. It's also important to note that the census should not be confused with the American Community Survey, which is also the large survey that's conducted by the Census Bureau. That's one that happens continuously throughout the year. Mostly government agencies use it, and it's basically information that was previously gathered in long versions of the census, so such as ancestry, educational attainment, income, disability, and so forth. So not to be confused with that, because this survey is really simple, and we'll go into that a bit more. So why is the census important? Well, here's what we know. The data collected for this 2020 census will determine roughly about $900 billion in federal funding that's allocated for really crucial services such as health and education programs, Head Start programs for our preschoolers, our transportation infrastructure, coverage for children's health insurance under the state's health insurance program, otherwise known as CHIP, and also Medicaid funding. So what does that mean for Colorado? Well, we know in the fiscal year of 2016, Colorado received almost $13.1 billion each year in federal funding. So based off of what the state's population was at the time, that's about $2,300 per person per year. So when we really think about it, we're talking about $23,000 per person for the next 10 years. I don't think anybody wants to leave that kind of money on the table. That means that it could support infrastructures that can really help individuals and communities here in Colorado, and why it's so important that we're making sure that folks are counted on the census, especially folks who are likely to benefit from the funds, such as young children or individuals who cannot access affordable health care, which we are kind of knowing and seeing as we're living through it in this pandemic right now, how important that is in vulnerable communities. What else is at stake? Again, as I mentioned before, it apportions about 435 members of House of Representatives will be divided among the states. The census again provides that kind of critical data that helps kind of determine how many seats each state receives. And so 2 things can happen. We can all partake in the census and potentially gain a seat because population has increased, or there have been instances where in some states or in some districts, if there's either not if there's been a decrease in population or not enough folks participating in the census, states can even lose a seat. And so we certainly don't want that to happen, and we want to make sure that everyone can participate, so then that way it is accurately reflected. And then also we know that the census data that's collected is going to impact the implementation of policies and laws throughout our state. The last thing we want is, for example, a district that may have a lot of young children not adequately count those children, because when it comes time for government programming such as Head Start or free lunch meal programs, If the numbers don't reflect that the population is there, then they're less likely to receive it. And so it really does show how important it is in terms of collecting that data and making sure that it even funnels in the way in which we implement policy. So with that, I will hand it over to Julian, who will talk a bit about frequently asked questions and how you fill out the census.
All right, sorry, I'm just trying to get my video started here. Let's see, Delana, you might need to enable my video.
We can hear you, Julian.
Oh, okay. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Julian Camera. I'm the field organizer at the ACLU of Colorado. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm going to go over right now some frequently asked questions and how to fill out the census. So some questions that we've had people ask in regards to the census over the last few weeks are listed here. And if your questions are not answered, feel free to put them in the question box below and we'll make sure to get them by the end of the presentation. So to start, who gets counted? Everyone living in the United States at the time of April 1st, 2020 is expected to be counted. To note, counting goes until August 14th, 2020, and so that may be confusing as to why April 1st is Census Day. That's because April 1st is the reference point for where you lived at the time of April 1st. So if you move in May and fill out your census in June, you're going to reference where you lived at the time of April 1st. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. So who gets counted? Or no, next will there be a question on citizenship? So because of a long, hard-fought battle at the Supreme Court by ACLU attorneys and others, there will not be a question on citizenship. Everyone living in the United States is included in the count, and your answers are protected by law, which Jess and Anna are going to talk about in a few moments here. Does everyone in my house need to fill out a census? No. So a census form is mailed to every household in the United States without a name. And I have one here. I don't know if you can see me, but this is what it looks like. And instead it says to the residents at and your address. So the reason for this is one person per household will be identified as your head of household and will be in charge of filling out the form for every resident in the entire household. So if you have roommates right now and you all decide to move in May and then you fill out your census in June, you're going to need to coordinate with the roommates that you lived with before you moved and see who's going to fill out the census for all of you. When will I receive my census form? So invitations to participate in the census began mailing in early March. I believe I received my first invitation at the beginning of March and my second in the middle. And then I filled out my census online, and so it didn't send me the actual form. So you get 2 invitations and then a form. Unless you fill out your census early, then you don't get your actual form. That moves on to the next question. What if I did not receive my form or I threw mine out, which someone who is watching this presentation did do, and I'm not going to call you out, and we don't judge here. So it's perfectly normal. But if you do not receive your form or you threw yours out, you can go online or you can call the number, which I'm about to provide to you. And you can act like you're starting to fill out the form. And when it prompts you for a confirmation code, just choose the option that says, I do not have my confirmation code, and it'll walk you through the steps. What questions will I be asked? And that takes us to our next slide. So sorry. So now I'm going to talk about how to fill out your census, and then I'll talk about what questions you'll be asked. So there's 3 ways to participate. You can participate online at 2020census.gov. You can participate by phone at 844-330-2020. You can participate by mail. People who live on college campuses, in nursing homes, are incarcerated, basically live in a group where someone is kind of in charge of keeping track of you. you will be assigned a quarter home administrator per that facility. They'll be in charge of counting everyone in that facility. When it comes to accessibility, there's 3 options available. So online, the online response option allows for you to navigate the form without a mouse and with assistive technology. There's a video guide in American Sign Language, which is available on the 2020 census.gov website. You'll see me reference that website a lot just because we are instructed to do so. And there's tons of information on that website. You can also participate by phone, where there's assistance available in over 13 different languages. You can also complete the census in English via phone that uses telephone technology for the deaf. That's also available on the 2020 census.gov website, as well as on our website. And you can participate by mail, where Braille and large print guides will be available to assist when filling out the paper form. So questions you'll be asked. You'll be asked your name, your address, your telephone number, your sex, if you're of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, and your race. When it comes to the question on sex, which is on the next slide, the question says, what is your sex, male or female? So gender options for trans and non-binary folks have been completely excluded from the census. So you're encouraged to pick the answer that you prefer. Coming from someone who is trans, this is extremely discouraging to feel that you're not being represented in the census, but it's still extremely important that we participate. The LGBTQ plus community tends to be one of the communities that goes undercounted. And Jess is going to talk about how undercounting affects particular communities in a few moments here. But if you are interested in talking about how to get gender options on the 2030 census, I'd love to talk about it. My email's right there. Please reach out. We can start talking about how to make that happen. Also, the 2020 census.gov website says these statistics help enforce laws, regulations, and policies against discrimination in government programs and in society. So I think there's plenty of room to add trans and non-binary folks to that. And then going on to the next slide. So questions on race and origin. So the questions are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And what is your race? So these are 2 separate questions. Your answers should be based on how you identify. Data from these questions are used to enforce anti-discrimination laws, such as those around equal employment opportunity. The data is also used when mapping congressional districts to ensure that minority voting strength is not being diluted and to comply with federal requirements. So for race, you can pick whatever combo or answer fits. You can write in an option, you can pick an option and write in an option, you can pick multiple options. This question has changed over time, where it originally kept the question about being of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin in the same question as race, and only allowing people to pick one answer. So over the past few decades, it's evolved, and they've separated the 2 questions and have acknowledged the fact that millions of people in the U.S. are of mixed races and identities, and that they should be represented when filling out the census. So I'll pass it back to Jess to kick off our Know Your Rights.
Okay. Sorry about that. For some reason, my cursor is getting really sensitive. So when we're talking about Know Your Rights, it's pretty, kind of straightforward in terms of, the things that we know. So what is it that you need to know? Your response is required by law, but also know that the census has a legal obligation to keep your information confidential. And under Title 13, which is the same title in which the Census Bureau is created, they cannot release any identifiable information about you, your home, your business, even to law enforcement. The census is really only supposed to be used to publish statistical data. Title 13 also ensures that your private data is protected and that your answers cannot be used against you by any government agency or court. So for folks that are going out and collecting census data, they basically, swear an oath to protect that information, and that whoever violates that law, it's considered a federal crime if they were to share that information. The Bureau is prohibited from using the survey results for any reason other than for statistical purposes. So what that means is that your answers on the survey can't be used legally for any type of enforcement, whether that be for immigration enforcement, housing enforcement, or other type of law enforcement, which I know Anna is going to talk a little bit about when we're talking about know your rights for immigrant communities. So what does that mean? It means that it's illegal for the Bureau to share with the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, FBI, HUD, and it's illegal for anyone in those other agencies to view individual responses. So we also want folks to know too that the Bureau isn't supposed to cross-reference answers with any other personal identifiable information from other surveys or sources or other documents, including birth certificates, driver's license, so forth. So basically what we're saying is it's okay to answer questions on the survey that may not necessarily match up if you put something different on another federal document. And hopefully, this is particularly important for LGBTQ communities because as Julian mentioned, when it comes to question of sex, there's only, put male or female. And so we definitely want folks to know to not be concerned about like, oh, but I may have put something else on like my driver's license and, is that going to be checked? No, it's not supposed to be checked in any way. Additionally, there are questions on the census, of course, asking people about other members in your household. Again, we want to make clear that it's really critical to count every person living in the household at the time, even if like they're not on your lease or even if they're not legally supposed to live there, because again, the Bureau does not collect information to enforce housing laws. Now, having said that, in terms of the census protecting individuals' information, in 1978, a law was passed that does allow the census to share information with the National Archives 72 years after the census has been taken. And this is usually meant for genealogical purposes, such as like tracking family histories and so forth. So for example, the 1940 census was released in April of 2012, and the 1950 census will be released in April of 2020. Or I'm sorry, April 2022, excuse me. For the 2020 census, that information will have to wait 72 years to be released, which won't be until April of 2092. Why 72 years? No one really says for sure, but the thinking is that that was at the time the average lifespan of an American. And so by the time that information was released, then that individual, would, may no longer be living. But the point of the matter is that for what you're filling out right now, that information is protected and it shouldn't be released to any other government agency. So in talking about privacy, I think is really important, to talk about that. The 2020 census is the first major push to move kind of the self-reporting electronically through online surveys, which I think has raised a lot of questions for many people about cybersecurity and the safety of your data. So what we know is that the Census Bureau does have a duty to keep your records confidential. And they do claim that they are using safeguards to help protect that confidentiality and keeping that information safe by either using two-factor authentication and encryption for the survey's responses. And so what that means is if, say, there is someone out in the field counting or going, door to door, which they really shouldn't be doing now, but, in the usual sense, if they were to have an iPad or a device that they were taking information, basically they would need a two-factor identification to open up the device in order to take that information. In terms of encryption, what that means is if you are filling out the census online, then when you fill out the survey and hit the submit button, that information gets encrypted. and then the information gets encrypted again when the responses are sent to the Census Bureau. And so those are the ways in which the census has been working to keep folks' information safe. So should you be worried about hackers, filling out the survey, for the first time, again, we're doing this online, but also know that online is not the only option. You can do it by paper form, you could do it by phone. And if you do it online, you could do it through a computer or a tablet or a phone. The Census Bureau is really serious about making sure that the information is secure. Of course, all of that information about how they're keeping it secure can be found on census.gov, which is the Census Bureau's website. And with that, we'll have Anna take it over to talk a bit about how the census impacts undocumented communities.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. So I do want to go over a lot of the information that immigrants and undocumented folks have been asking about the census. I know that there has been a lot of fear with filling out the census, and this time around, it is very apparent that immigrants and the undocumented community are the people that are being targeted the most with fear tactics to be counted out of the census. And so the best way for us, either as affected community or as allies, to ensure that immigrants and undocu folks do fill out the census is by sharing correct and accurate information to our communities. So the first part that I do want to go over is, if you live in a shared immigrant household, how do you fill out the census? And basically, you want to ensure that everyone that is living inside of the household as of April 1st, 2020 should be counted. And that means anyone who is living and sleeping in the house most of the time, even if someone is crashing and has no usual home anywhere else, they should be counted when you fill out the census. And this was particularly important for me and in my household because we do have agricultural workers that for a season, they will leave, they will no longer be living at the house for the grow season and the harvest season, but they do live there for the rest of the year. And so whoever is living in the majority of the year in that house, you want to make sure that they are counted in your census. Next slide, please. And as far as citizenship, Julian touched it a little bit, but 100% there will not be a question about citizenship or legal status on the census. And this is still the hardest piece of information to get through to community. Every single time that I talk about the census with community members, whether it be with different stakeholders or we're doing like a Facebook Live, one of the biggest questions is, will there be a citizenship question? And if I'm undocumented, can I fill out the census? No, there will not be a citizenship question or a legal status question on the census. And undocumented people can and should participate in the census. Next slide, please. And what is on the census? I know we touched on this a little bit, but I want to make sure that we know before we go into it what is going to be included on the census. That way we are not scared of filling it out. And so it's basic questions like, do you own or rent? How many people are living in your home? What are the ages and genders of the people living in your home? Very basic information. They just want to make sure that they get an accurate count for the people that are in your home. Next slide, please. And what the census will never have is a question about immigration status or your social security number. bank or credit card account numbers or information to fill out any of your banking accounts. It will never ask you for money or donations, and it will never have anything on behalf of a political party. And I think that these are very important for folks to know, just so that we ensure 100% that people aren't being misguided or tricked into filling out something that is not the census. And then next slide, please. And then again, about the confidentiality regarding in terms of the census. Again, I know folks are very scared of where their information is going to go, and Jess touched on this really well. And another point that I would add is that the people that signed up to work for the census, they signed a legal document saying that they will not share out any of this information. And if they do, they face a fine up to $250,000 if they end up breaking any of those laws. And so for the canvassers, for the admin staff that is working on the census, that is a hefty fine for them to take the risk. At even sharing that information. It's definitely not something that a person that is making the $15, $20 an hour would want to take by just sharing information. And so 100%, and Jess also touched on this, that everything is encrypted. The census makes sure that there is no virtual way for anyone to pull out personal information that is not meant for statistical reasons. And yes, the census will not be shared with any other law enforcement agencies. This includes DHS, ICE, FBI, CIA, and they cannot use your personal information. All the information that can be accessed by these agencies are 100% encrypted. They do not have any personal information. And the census cannot share this information with any of these agencies. And it's very important to make sure that if anyone has any doubt that there will be either a citizenship question or that ICE will be able to get this information, if anyone says otherwise that that they are misinformed. And trying to scare folks to not participate, because 100% the census is confidential and it is not shared with other law enforcement agencies. Next slide, please. And if you don't fill out the census, what will happen is that the U.S. Census Bureau will follow up in person with households that haven't responded to the census. And I know that there is a lot of fear with someone knocking at your door, and we will get into that right now. And so the next slide, we will be going over the census, undocumented communities, and knowing your rights. And so the first piece of knowing your rights is knowing the difference between a census canvasser and ICE. A census canvasser will identify themselves as a census canvasser after knocking. They will have a badge identifying that they work for the census, and they will have a briefcase or an iPad indicating their affiliation with the Census Bureau. They will be, from experiences, from just knowing how ICE operates in the past and coming to your home, the knock from a census canvasser will be completely different. It will be more of a like, hey, are you home knock, and a little bit more gentle than an ICE agent that is pounding at your door, making sure that you hear their knock. So an ICE agent should identify themselves as Immigration and Customs Enforcement after knocking, and they will come looking for a specific person. A census canvasser will want to count all the people in your household and will be wanting to just collect that information, versus an ICE agent that will be looking for a specific person, and they should have an arrest warrant signed by a judge asking for that very specific person. The next slide, please. And so also knowing your rights, we do encourage all people to complete the census because of its importance to our community. But if you ever feel uncomfortable, one of the best ways of making sure that you are able to muster up the courage of opening the door is knowing your rights and knowing what rights you have before you open the door. And so as the Immigration Campaign Coordinator, I recommend that you find out who is on the other side of the door before you open it. So whether it's you look through the peephole or you look through the window, that you make sure that you know who is on the other side of the door before you open it. And this also includes our kids that I know for my little brother, when someone knocks at the door, or when I come over to my mom's house and I knock at the door, all he does is unlocks the door, opens it, and then starts running, trying to hide so that he could scare me. So we need to also talk to our kids about protocols when it comes to who is knocking, knowing who is on the other side of the door before we open it, before we give anyone permission to enter into our home, because by giving them permission to enter into our home, we are also giving them that permission of questioning all of our household members. And so you also have to remember that you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to a translator. And if there's anything that is being asked of you or being given to you in a piece of paper and you do not understand, and you don't understand what language they're presenting you this information with, you have the right to a translator. And then please do not sign anything without an attorney present. We give this piece of advice because we know that ICE agents try to push voluntary deportation on folks. And so this is just the across the board, just please do not sign anything without an attorney present. And if you would like a full Know Your Rights training, you have two options, whether it's visiting our immigration microsite, allourwelcomeco.org, or tuning in next Tuesday for our Know Your Rights, Immigration Rights webinar. And with that, I think that my portion is done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. I think what Anna, covered really kind of drives home the importance to really understand that there are communities out there that have genuine concerns about anybody from the government coming to knock on their door, and kind of really chose to talk about why such as like immigrant communities tended to kind of be our hard to count communities when it comes to filling out the census. So what is a hard to count community or population? Basically, they're populations for whom there's a real or even perceived barrier that exists in terms of being able to include them in data collection. Some common examples of hard to count communities include people who are experiencing homelessness, folks who are members of the LGBTQ community, immigrant or undocumented communities, communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities, and even young children tend to fall into our what we consider to be hard to count communities. And this could be for a myriad of reasons. Some of the ones that we see is that either folks are hard to locate. These are populations that are both hard to kind of sample and identify because of some characteristics, such as perhaps they move around quite a bit and not sure in terms of where they live as of April 1st. Some are hard to contact communities. So that means that even when they are located, it could be difficult to physically access them. So folks who are in gated communities all the way to people who are experiencing homelessness. We also have hard to persuade folks, and those are folks that even if you are to access them in the enumeration process, it's really, the population is really reluctant for some really justified reasons, such as undocumented communities, or folks who are like, screw the system, I'm not giving you any information. Sometimes could be hard to persuade to participate in the census. And then we have also folks who are considered hard to interview. So that's even once, we engage them, the census process itself can be difficult because there may be a lack of a shared language or some form of disability in terms of hard of hearing or hard to communicate. And so, of course, each of these, aren't work at a silo. They can compound upon each other. And sometimes you'll have communities that are experiencing multiple reasons as to why it may be hard to include them into the census. So we know that the census already has a history of undercounting communities, particularly communities of color. We know that in 2010, the census failed to count 1.5 million Black and Latino Latinx individuals. And so what that basically meant is that the census missed about 2.1% of Black Americans and 1.5% of the Hispanic population. We also know that about 5% of Indigenous Americans were also undercounted in the 2010 census, and those Indigenous Americans who were living on the reservation were undercounted, and that even nearly 2% of folks who marked their race or minority as other were also undercounted. So what we are also potentially seeing in terms of hard to count communities because of what is currently happening with the pandemic and working to practice social distancing is that because we are working such a hard push for online surveys that folks who have limited access to internet will probably also be considered a hard to count community because if they, may not have access to a phone or internet, or if they, don't have like a actual residential like address to receive mail, then it becomes, really tough. And so, we just want to try to figure out and get really creative in ways in which we can reach out to those communities. Again, as I mentioned earlier in our webinar, about close to 63,000 folks in Colorado are at risk of being undercounted, and that's according to the Urban Institute. And we do see that this could be reduced if, we encourage more response and reporting than what is usually expected. We do think that, and based off of kind of what the trends here in Colorado, that underreporting usually ends up happening in rural areas, particularly in the 3rd congressional district, which is essentially the Western Slope. And so, of course, we'll talk later on, or Julian will talk later on in terms of taking action, in terms of how we can make sure that this side of of the Western Slope is included in the census. And of course, I think one really important thing to consider when it comes to encouraging hard to count communities to participate in the census is being able to connect with census partners and trusted community organizations and messengers to talk about how the census truly impacts them in their daily lives. So we know that the NAACP, Black sororities and fraternities are really making the push in Black communities to ensure folks are counted. One Colorado has really been taking on the leadership in the LGBT community to ensure that folks are counted. For our immigrant, Latinx, undocumented communities, COPA and Mi Familia Vota have also been making those pushes to really kind of stress the importance of why folks should fill out the census. Colorado Coalition of the Homeless has been really working hard, and you know that it's a because of social distancing and the pandemic, there's a lot of timelines are getting pushed for folks who are experiencing homelessness. Usually there's what's called a service-based enumeration, where there are certain days where folks go in person to soup kitchens and shelters to kind of take that data and information, and we're having to kind of push those dates around because of social distancing, but we're keeping track of making sure that eventually those communities are being counted and they are being seen and they're being heard. And then for disability communities, Colorado Cross Disability Coalition has also been working really hard to make sure folks in the disability community are counted as well. Julian, Anna, did I miss any organizations or any community partners that we should lift up in terms of doing census outreach?
You hit it on my end.
Okay.
Yep, you're good. Just any other ones that I would like to just shout out are CIRC, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, and a few others just across the state, but those are the main ones.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so with that, now that we kind of know the resources, we know the lay of the land, how to fill out the census, why it's important, Julian will go into how you may be able to help if you've already filled out the census, but you want to get others to fill out the census as well so that they can be counted. Then Julian's going to talk about how you can get involved.
Okay, so in case you're wondering, there is a way to make use of all of this information that we just shared with you without leaving your home, without leaving your couch. And I'd be failing as an organizer if I didn't ask you to go tell all of your friends and family everything you just learned and encourage them to participate in the census. So another way is to join our at-home census outreach team. We are sending texts to thousands of Coloradans in communities that are hard to count that Jess just talked about, encouraging them to participate. And before we begin our texting outreach, we'll provide you with a training on all the tools you need, and then you're able to send out hundreds of texts with the click of a button. So if you're able to do so, it's really convenient, and feel free to contact myself at jcamera@aclu-co.org, or Jen, who's our campaign coordinator, at jsamano@aclu-co.org. We'd love to have people help out with this. So now I think we can move on to questions.
Yeah.
Great, that was just wonderful. I learned so much, and I should have known all that. So we do have some really great questions, and if Anna, if you want to come on too, so you can help us answer them. The first question is, if you aren't already going to cover this, can you please talk about ICE detained people? Will they be counted? If so, how do we hold ICE accountable? Well, we ask that question every day at the ACLU. How do we hold ICE accountable? But can somebody speak to that question about people in detention?
You know, it is unclear to me of how and if folks within detention centers will be counted. But I can definitely look into it and share out what that answer is.
By law, ICE detention centers are required to count all people living in their detention centers. And so we'll call them, we'll make sure that they did it. But, you know, at that point, we can get your contact info. By law, they are required to.
Okay.
So we did get an answer to that. And from our public policy director, and it sounds like they won't be counted unless they are released in time to respond.
Okay. So that's a hard one, and we'll get some clarification on that since yeah, but probably not. And like I said, we are trying to hold ICE accountable every day at the ACLU. That's not an easy thing to do. The next question is, does the response to the gender, but as they say, sex question, affect government funding for women's health?
So, Max, I really appreciate this question. I think it's a phenomenal question. This is what the census website says about the funding and why they collect statistics about males and females. They say, we ask about sex of each person to create statistics about male and females. Census data about sex are used in planning and funding government programs and in evaluating other government programs and policies to ensure they fairly and equitably serve the needs of male and females. These statistics are also used to enforce law, regulations, and policies against discrimination in government programs and in society. We do know that some of the funding that comes from the census, the federal funding, does go to health insurance. But if you can drop me your contact info, I'm going to look into this question more and see if I can get you a definite answer.
And the next question is, how will you be able to identify actual census workers? And I think we identified that I think we covered that. They do have to have identification, correct, from government?
Yes, they do. They will have, census canvassers will have ways to identify that they are in fact a census canvasser.
Okay. And this is a great question. How does the census know if two people at the same address fill it out?
Sorry, I can give that shot again.
And don't, and the next part of that is, and then they don't double count things. So how do they know that?
Yeah, so I've become kind of a little bit of a census nerd. So when you fill out your census, well, you get a confirmation code in the mail. That's what your invitation has. Let's see if I can pull it. No, you can't see it. So you get a confirmation code. When you fill out your census, that confirmation code is for your address specifically. So when you fill out the census, you are filling out for your household. So if another person fills it out from your residence, it just won't be able to happen. So one per household.
And this is also from Max. Do incarcerated get counted in the census? And if yes, where? So do they get counted at their home, or do they get counted at the prison or jail that they may be in?
So our public policy director can correct me if I'm wrong, but folks who are incarcerated, usually again through kind of service-based enumeration, the census is supposed to choose and pick days in which they go to facilities or institutions that have like kind of groups of people living in the same space to have them counted. Kind of another that may not necessarily be living at home at the time, or college students. But yes, my understanding is that they are counted, but the census does like choose like a day in which they go about doing that.
Okay, so our public policy director also said they are counted currently in the prison. There is a law moving through the legislature to have them counted by their residence, not location of the prison. And as I was telling Julian the other day, I actually found my grandfather in the 1930 census in prison in Georgia. And he was counted there, and the rest of his family was counted in West Virginia. So that's some of the fun stuff you can use the census for later.
Yeah, Jess said there's 22 census that have been conducted, so I'm sure there's some history there.
Yeah,
we do know that the 1890 census was lost in a fire. But yeah, you go to the National Archives and you can see quite a bit. We were able, my grandparents or my husband's grandparents were just now able to see themselves counted for the first time, to actually see that in the census for the first time. And they're now in their 80s.
Well, that's really cool. Yeah, so most of you have a while to wait for that. Okay, and let's see. I don't think we have any other questions. I want to check the chat again, make sure we're good there. So no, if there are any other questions, this is the moment to let us know. And just so you all know, and do a little public service announcement, we will be doing this again Tuesday night at 6:30. We will be going over our newly written and formatted and beautiful Know Your Rights book for immigrants. Anna will be leading that training. You can register for it at peoplepower.org. Just put in a Colorado zip code and it should come up. If you have any trouble, you can contact any of us and we'll get you signed up for it. All right.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Oh, nothing. I just want to write down an email before it gets closed out.
Okay, you do that.
That's all.
Well, again, thank you so much to our panelists. This was a wonderfully informing evening, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as us, and we hope to see you on Tuesday night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.